Dear sisters, and all friends who are joining us this evening, welcome to this special session on unity and overcoming racism as part of the Hyde Park Stakes Women's Conference 2020. For your information, this session is being recorded. Before we begin, for those who require translation into Portuguese, you can click the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen, where you'll find Joanna Dias of the City Ward is kindly providing the live translation today. Sisters, we are really pleased that you are here today to join with us in this session. We'll be learning about the Church's history with race, listening to the lived experiences of some of our Black sisters in the stake, and discussing how we can individually and collectively abandon any prejudice we may have in order to help our Black sisters and brothers feel a needed and cherished part of our congregations. My name is Charlotte Steinfeld, and I'm the first counsellor in the Stake Relief Society presidency of the Hyde Park Stake, and I've been invited to co-host this session with Sister Lola Ogunbote of the Stratford Ward. Lola and I are friends who met several years ago as Lola was embarking on a legal career. From trained to be a barrister to the Crown Prosecution Service to Goldman Sachs, Lola has now shifted her career focus to sport and has been involved in coaching men, women and girls around the world, including for the Arsenal Football Club's partner community programs. She has coached in places such as Mozambique, South Africa, Australia and Beijing. Lola now works to provide a voice for girls through sport. Lola's beautiful face you may also recognise from the I Am a Mormon campaign that the church rolled out in London several years ago. An article on race that Lola contributed to has become one of the most read articles in LDS Living's history. Welcome, Lola.
Thank you, Charlotte.
On the screen right now, you will also see the faces of those who will be participating in this session. We welcome you, Professor Paul Reeve, Lee Odemer and Madeline Hale, who will be introduced as we move through the session. Our session today will be split into two parts. Firstly, we will hear from an acclaimed scholar and active member of the church, Professor Paul Reeve, the Simmons Professor of Mormon History at the University of Utah, who has extensively researched the church's history as it pertains to race. Following Professor Reeve's presentation and our further discussion with him, we will move to a panel discussion with both Black and white sisters from our stake, followed by a question and answer session. We'd like to ask for your patience and engagement as we move through the session, which will conclude at about 6:30 p.m, when each of us, including Professor Reeve, will be available to answer questions. We acknowledge that speaking about race and racism can be a difficult topic for some, both Black and white. Some are disaffected, some genuinely feel a struggle to grapple with the history of the church and or history of society. Some struggle to grapple with their experiences of prejudice or to make sense of them. Some do not know how they can change themselves, and some do not know how they can help. We hope this evening that you will find that we have provided a safe space for you to explore and engage with the issues of race and how we can all become more unified. We want you to know that we have not embarked upon this session lightly. Each of us here today, both hosts and panel members, have wrestled with this topic and how best to present this session to you. We have met over months to discuss how best to provide this space, and we have been prayerful in so doing. We've also participated in a fast together to ensure that the Spirit is with us this evening as we speak. We hope that you will feel the power of our preparations. We had always planned to hold an event on overcoming racism as a Stake Relief Society. However, we today acknowledge that the catalyst for holding the event in this conference was the death of Black American George Floyd and the surrounding events. This event rightly pushed to the surface feelings and questions on race, identity and belonging for both our Black and white community. As a Stake Relief Society presidency, we commend and are deeply grateful to each of the sisters on this panel today for their vulnerability and their bravery in being willing to speak with you this evening. We also acknowledge that this event coincides with Black History Month. However, as a stake, we are determined the spotlight will be continuously shone on this issue until we have succeeded in our goal of unity. We've invited each Ward Relief Society presidency to hold a discussion as a result of this event during their next Relief Society lesson. We have invited the wards to discuss the issues that arise today and discuss what can be done going forward in a tangible way with unity in mind. A member of this panel and or the Stake Relief Society presidency will attend each ward to assist in facilitating that discussion and to be available to answer questions. We plan for this conversation today and that one to be followed by a sustained effort by the stake. Sisters, we do not have all the answers and we cannot apologise on behalf of the church as a whole for the policies that we've enacted. But we as a state can begin a conversation with you, which you can continue on in your wards and with your families. Inevitably, you will have questions as we go through the session, and they might be directed to any one of the speakers and panelists. When a question comes to mind, please could you type it in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a little icon down there. We'll endeavour to answer as many of these questions as we can at the end of the session. All of those questions, you can be reassured, will be anonymous. Finally, you may be asking, why are we discussing racism towards our Black African brothers and sisters today? Why are we not discussing other forms of racism? There is a simple and clear reason for this. Our church focused its policies specifically against Black African men and women, and the legacy of this remains. Now, since the priesthood restrictions were lifted, Black members of the church have been embraced into the fold. However, little has been discussed since on the effects of those restrictions on our Black members. In 2013, the church placed on its website an essay called Race and the Priesthood, which you can still find there today. It was approved by the First Presidency in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and used the best scholarship available from various scholars and the Church History Department. It sought to give information on the church's history regarding race. I want to read to you a portion of this today, so that if there are any in the room who are unsure as to the church's position on race, and in particular the standing of our Black African sisters and brothers, you can be very clear. It says, today, the church disavows the theories advanced in the past that Black skin is, and this is my numerical emphasis, 1, a sign of divine disfavor or curse. 2, or that it reflects unrighteous actions in a premortal life. 3, that mixed race marriages are a sin. 4, or that Blacks or people of any other race or ethnicity are inferior in any way to anyone else. Church leaders today unequivocally condemn all racism, past and present, in any form. I'll now introduce to you Professor Paul Reeve, who will give us a presentation on the history of race in the church. Professor Paul Reeve is the Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies in the History Department of the University of Utah and an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His book, Religion of a Different Color, which I have here, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. OUP is the largest and one of the most prestigious university presses in the world. Professor Reeve's book has received 3 Best Book Awards since its publication. Professor Reeve is also project manager and general editor of Century of Black Mormons, a digital history database designed to identify all known Black Mormons baptized into the faith between 1830 and 1930. The database can be found at www.centuryofblackmormons.org, all one word. Professor Reeve's scholarship has also been considered and used by the Church History Department. Welcome, Professor Reeve.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Stake Relief Society presidency for the invitation to be with you. It's a real honor to share with you some of my scholarship about history of the church and race. I'm just going to do a screen share here, which will help me to walk through the history and share with you some of the lessons that I've learned over the last decade as I've studied this issue. In my estimation, the best way to think about this issue is in 3 broad phases. The founding of the faith was characterized by open priesthood and temples. Across the course of the 19th century, the church implemented policies which reinforced segregated priesthood and temples firmly in place by the beginning of the 20th century. Then the June 1978 revelation under President Kimball returned the church to its universal roots. Didn't take it in a new direction, but in fact restored it back to where the church began. This may be kind of a new understanding for some of you, so I'll spend the rest of the presentation giving you evidence to support these claims. So the first lesson, as I began studying this, the first lesson that I learned is simply that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the first couple of decades created an inclusive racial vision. Joseph Smith received at least 4 revelations instructing him that the gospel must be preached unto every creature. We like to quote unto every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, but I would love for you to think about what it means when we say unto every creature. It's less ambiguous. No one is left out. This gospel was intended for everyone. No, white people first and then black people in parallel to Jews first and then Gentiles. It just simply doesn't exist. Evidence indicates that this is, in fact, a gospel meant for everyone. We are all God's children. Jesus Christ himself declared to Joseph Smith in 1831, all flesh is mine. He claimed all flesh as his, and then began this new dispensation by declaring, I am no respecter of persons. There is simply all kinds of evidence to indicate that early Latter-day Saints took those notions seriously. Elijah Abel is the most well-known documented person of Black African descent ordained into the LDS priesthood. The first, but there were others in the first couple of decades. And the information that you see there just simply substantiates what we know about Elijah Abel and his engagement with the priesthood and with the faith. He's ordained an elder by Ambrose Palmer in New Portage, Ohio on the 25th of January, 1836. Joseph Smith Jr. acknowledged this ordination with his signature 2 months later on Elijah Abel's ministerial certificate. That same year, in December of 1836, Elijah Abel is ordained to the Third Quorum of the 70, which was a missionary unit in the 19th century, not a general authority unit like we understand today. But what this meant is that Elijah Abel was an ordained minister and missionary for the church, and he will in fact serve 3 missions as a Latter-day Saint member of the Third Quorum of the 70. Also in 1836, Elijah Abel received his washing and anointing rituals in the Kirtland Temple. Remember, that's as far as the temple ceremonies were introduced to that point. He did go to Nauvoo, but moved to Cincinnati, Ohio before the endowment was introduced. But he was amongst the first to perform baptisms for the dead in Nauvoo. We have other indications of this open racial attitude. The Times and Seasons newspaper published in Nauvoo as the temple there was under construction indicates the expansive vision that the Latter-day Saints had for who would gather to Nauvoo. They envisioned people from every land and from every nation, the polished European, the degraded Hottentot, and the shivering Laplander. And then the same article anticipated that persons of all languages and of every tongue and of every color who shall with us worship the Lord of hosts in his holy temple and offer up their orisons in his sanctuary. In other words, an open racial vision as to who would be welcomed into the temple that was under construction in Nauvoo. And we can go all the way to March of 1847 with Brigham Young on record with this same open racial vision. So remember, this is 3 years after Joseph Smith is dead. We have the minutes of a fascinating meeting that takes place at winter quarters between a Black Latter-day Saint named William McCary and Brigham Young. McCary is complaining that he is not being treated equally by his fellow saints at winter quarters. He's experiencing racism. And Brigham Young in this interview tries to reassure William McCary. He tells him that we are all a part of God's broader human family. He paraphrases Acts 17:26. It's nothing to do with the blood, for of one blood has God made all flesh. McCary persists and says that he's being treated unfairly because of his color. And Brigham Young insists we don't care about the color. And when McCary says that he doesn't have any positions of authority in the church, Brigham Young cites favorably a Black priesthood holder as evidence that the church doesn't discriminate even in distributing priesthood authority. Brigham Young says we have one of the best elders, an African in Lowell, a barber. Brigham Young is referring to Q. Walker Lewis, who is an ordained elder in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch, and he is a barber by trade. So the information that Brigham Young articulates about who Q Walker Lewis was matches up perfectly with what historians have been able to verify. He was ordained, Q Walker Lewis was ordained an elder by William Smith, who was an apostle at the time, the younger brother of Hiram and Joseph Smith. And Brigham Young is on record in March 1847 as favorably aware of Q Walker Lewis, and in fact, calling him one of the best elders. So open racial vision all the way up through March of 1847. What did this open racial vision look like to those people who were on the outside looking in? The evidence that I uncovered was simply that outsiders looking in suggested that members of the church were too inclusive of the very people that American society knew should be segregated and even enslaved. These are just some quotes from newspapers and other sources from the 1830s and 40s about how outsiders described Latter-day Saints and their inclusive vision. These are accusations, not celebrations of Latter-day Saint diversity. The charge was that Latter-day Saints accepted all nations and colors. Mormon elders maintained communion with the Indians and walked out with colored women was one charge leveled against missionaries preaching in the South. Latter-day Saints welcomed all classes and characters into their society. They included aliens by birth and people from different parts of the world as members of God's earthly family. They honored the natural equality of mankind without accepting the Native Indians or the African race. They included both Native Americans and African Americans. And you have to understand that in 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in the United States, the same year as the founding of the church, and Native Americans were rounded up and moved beyond the Mississippi River as a solution to what was called the Indian problem in the United States. So this accusation is simply that the Latter-day Saints are accepting the very people that the rest of white society knows should be excluded. In Missouri, the charge leveled against the Saints was that they had opened an asylum for rogues and vagabonds and free blacks, and that they even promoted Black ascendancy over the whites. They didn't understand the proper racial hierarchy in the United States, and they were violating racial norms, was the accusation. Especially after polygamy is openly acknowledged by the Latter-day Saints, these accusations took on a life of their own. My book includes a lot more examples. I'll just share one with you. This is published in Thomas Sherwood's Comic History of the United States in 1870. It's simply titled A Mormon Family Out for a Walk. This illustration obviously includes an enfeebled male patriarch out front, a long string of wives, and a seemingly endless string of children. But it's not the number of wives and children that we should really pay attention to, but it's the de facto interracial nature of this imagined Mormon family. You'll notice a stereotypical Black mammy from the plantation South, an Asian wife, and a Native American or Pacific Islander wife. In this imagination, Latter-day Saint polygamy is not merely destroying the traditional family, it's destroying the white race. And really what's at stake is America's democratic experiment. Senator John C. Calhoun had said on the floor of the United States Senate that democracy is the government of a white race. His argument was that non-white people were racially incapable of democracy. So as outsiders looked in on the Latter-day Saints, they suggested that Latter-day Saint polygamy actually facilitated race mixing, darkening the white race, making it unfit for democracy. It wasn't merely a suspect religious group, but in fact, American democracy that was at stake. So Latter-day Saint whiteness was called into question. In the 19th century, in the United States, the most significant way you can claim whiteness for yourself is in distance from Blackness. So we see the priesthood and temple restrictions developing over time out of an effort at claiming whiteness for the church, even at the expense of its own Black converts. Let me share with you some of the evidence to support this claim. So back to 1847, Remember, Brigham Young, after his interview with William McCary, will lead a group of Latter-day Saints into northern Mexico to establish a new settlement in the Salt Lake Valley. At the same time that Brigham Young is leading that vanguard group into the Salt Lake Valley, a man by the name of William Appleby has been appointed to survey the conditions of the branches of the church on the East Coast. By his own account, Appleby travels over 2,000 miles that summer. He goes from branch to branch to branch, just trying to understand their condition, who's ready to immigrate once Brigham Young establishes a new gathering place. And when he gets to the Lowell, Massachusetts branch, William Appleby is incredibly concerned. He sits down and writes a letter to Brigham Young on 2nd of June, 1847. He's concerned by what he finds there. He meets Q. Walker Lewis, a Black ordained elder. We already know that Brigham Young is aware of Q. Walker Lewis because he referred to him favorably in March of 1847, but this is the first time that William Appleby has met Q. Walker Lewis. And he writes to Brigham Young, "Now, dear brother, I wish to know if this is the order of God or tolerated in this church. Do we really ordain Negroes to the priesthood?" And then he's much more disturbed by something else he finds in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch. Q. Walker Lewis's son Enoch is also a baptized Latter-day Saint, and he has married Mary Matilda Webster, a white baptized Latter-day Saint, and they have a child together. The pre-Civil War term for race mixing was amalgamation, borrowed from metallurgy to mean the mixing of metals and applied to race, meaning the mixing of races. William Appleby, first question, do we allow Black people to be ordained to the priesthood? Second question, do we allow amalgamation? He's actually disgusted by the fact that Enoch Lewis is married to Mary Matilda Webster and they have a child together. And he wants to know if this is actually permitted in the church. We know that William Appleby is a racist because that night he also sits down and writes in his journal. He says, "I've never been so disgusted in all my life. Oh woman, where is your shame?" Speaking of Mary Matilda Webster, a white woman, how could you marry a Black man and have a child? And I've never been so disgusted that these are members of my faith. So we have an indication of how he feels about interracial marriage and what he finds in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch. And it's in fact William Appleby who gets to report directly to Brigham Young on the 3rd of December, 1847. Brigham Young, remember, had gone to the Salt Lake Valley and then returned to winter quarters. And William Appleby meets with Brigham Young on the 3rd of December and gives him his report in person about his survey of the branches of the church on the East Coast. That meeting lasts for over 4 hours. Unfortunately, only 13 handwritten lines survive as the notes from that meeting. We don't know exactly what William Appleby said or the nature of the conversation, except for the fact that those 13 handwritten lines are drenched with concern over race mixing. It's evident that he is reporting to Brigham Young the interracial nature of the marriage at Lowell, Massachusetts. And Brigham Young speaks out stridently against race mixing, even advocating capital punishment as a penalty. We see then Brigham Young moving in a decidedly different direction from the minutes of this meeting until he openly announces a racial restriction in January and February of 1852 in Utah Territory. The context for the open announcement of a racial priesthood restriction is a debate taking place in the Utah Territorial Legislature over a Black servant code, which is designed to govern the relationship between white enslavers who have converted to the church in the American South and brought with them their enslaved people to the Great Basin. Some of those enslaved people are also baptized Latter-day Saints. So what you have in the Great Basin in Salt Lake Valley are white Latter-day Saints enslaved fellow Black Latter-day Saints. And the legislative body is debating what law will govern that legal relationship in Utah Territory. They're also debating the election bill. And those two bills really produce Brigham Young's most strident articulation of a racial restriction. He will argue that people of Black African descent are descendants of Cain, and they inherit, he says, the curse of Cain. This curse of Cain is part of the broader Judeo-Christian tradition that predates even the founding of the faith by a couple of centuries. It's a broader Christian tradition about an interpretation of the book of Genesis and the mark that God put on Cain. Brigham Young inherited this from his Protestant Christianity and then brought it into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and gave it theological weight in 1852. He said that because Cain killed his brother Abel, all of Cain's descendants would have to wait to receive the priesthood until all of Abel's descendants had received the priesthood. That's the argument that he makes in January and February 1852. The problem is his justification for a racial restriction violates Joseph Smith's second article of faith, wherein he tells us that we are held accountable for our own sins, not for Adam's transgression. In Brigham Young's articulation, the supposed descendants of Cain, who we understood to be Black people, were held accountable for a murder in which they took no part. Because it's a violation of the second article of faith, what you have then are other Latter-day Saint leaders across the course of the 19th and 20th century that suggest, well, agency must have been involved in some sort of way. People of Black African descent must have exercised their agency poorly in the premortal war in heaven, in our pre-earth life. They may have been neutral, less valiant, or fence-sitters. Those are alternative explanations that allow for agency to get around the theological pressure point that Brigham Young creates with his explanation. And he never deviates from that explanation. It's important to remember that it happens in a debate with Orson Pratt, who was a legislator and an apostle at the time. Pratt is disgusted that Latter-day Saints would contemplate legalizing slavery in Utah Territory. He moved that the bill be rejected outright. He argued that only God administers divine curses and they are not multi-generational. He said, "Shall we take then the innocent African that has committed no sin and damn him to slavery and bondage without receiving any authority from heaven to do so?" He found the idea preposterous and said it was enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. Orson Pratt also advocated for Black male voting rights in the 1852 legislative session. So very much speaking in favor of racial equality at the same time that Brigham Young was arguing for racial restrictions. The next moment that we should be aware of in the development of the racial restriction is 1879, when Elijah Abel actually applies to be sealed to his wife and to receive his endowments, the rest of his temple rituals. He and his family had immigrated to Utah in 1853. His wife passed away in 1877, and he wanted her to be sealed to him for eternity and to receive the rest of his temple rituals. Brigham Young is now dead, and he applies to John Taylor, Brigham Young's successor. So remember then, as late as 1879, if the racial restrictions are firmly in place, why would the leader of the church need to conduct an investigation? And in fact, that's what happens in 1879. John Taylor isn't aware of what to do. So it's just further evidence that the restrictions aren't solidified in place even as late as 1879. John Taylor conducts an investigation, sends Joseph F. Smith to interview Elijah Abel. What you see on your screen are the minutes that Joseph F. Smith scrawls from his interview with Elijah Abel. And Abel simply substantiates his status as a Black priesthood holder and says that Joseph Smith sanctioned his priesthood. Joseph F. Smith brings those notes back to his interview with Taylor, and Taylor's decision is to allow Elijah Abel's priesthood to stand, but not allow him temple admission. So you have the development of a racial temple restriction to parallel the priesthood restriction. Remember, it bars Black women from temple admission, not just Black men. Elijah Abel will nonetheless serve a third mission for the church in his early 70s. He goes to Ohio preaching the gospel as an ordained member of the Third Quorum of the 70. He returns in December of 1884 and dies 2 weeks later. His obituary is published in the Deseret News. I don't know who wrote it, but it's different than a typical eulogy. It's a substantiation of his status as a Black priesthood holder. And it concludes that he labored successfully in Canada and also performed a mission in the United States, from which he returned about 2 weeks ago. He died in full faith of the gospel. Between his return and the turn of the 20th century, then, the restriction just simply grows in accumulating precedent. Each succeeding generation unwilling to violate the precedent of the previous generation, even though, remember, Brigham Young's substantiation of the restriction is a violation of the open attitude Joseph Smith had. It's firmly solidified in place, I believe, under Joseph F. Smith. And we see this moment in 1908 when Joseph F. Smith falsely remembers back and erases from collective Latter-day Saint memory the Black priesthood holders that complicate the white story, and it's a part of this Latter-day Saint passage to whiteness. So in 1879, Joseph F. Smith defended Abel's priesthood as valid. In 1895, he reminded Latter-day Saint leaders that Abel was ordained to the priesthood at Kirtland under the prophet Joseph Smith. In 1904, the slippage begins. He calls Abel's ordination a mistake that was never corrected. And then in 1908, he claimed that Abel's priesthood ordination was declared null and void by the prophet himself. So in this false memory, then Joseph F. Smith is suggesting the priesthood restriction was in place from the beginning. God put it in place. Human beings can't do anything about it. It will take a revelation to get rid of. And at the same meeting, the leadership of the faith decide that missionaries, quote, should not take the initiative in proselyting among the Negro people. But if Negroes or people tainted with Negro blood apply for baptism themselves, they might be admitted to church membership in the understanding that nothing further can be done for them. Remember, Joseph Smith has 4 revelations saying unto every creature. By 1908, we stop actively proselyting amongst people of Black African descent. It's no wonder then in the 20th century that the church becomes known as a white church, because we make deliberate decisions to stop seeking Black converts. And June 1978, then President Kimball will claim a revelation that will return us to our universal roots, not taking us in a new direction, in my estimation, but restoring us back to the universalism that typified the founding generation of the faith. I know this is a difficult history. What can we do? Let me just leave you with an expression of my faith, and I think the strength that Latter-day Saints can possess in the 21st century. In my estimation, it's much more profitable to learn from our collective history rather than defend or deny it. What lessons can it teach? Latter-day Saints experienced racialization at the hands of outsiders, and Latter-day Saints engaged in racism on the inside. What better people then to lead out on issues of racial inequality and social justice? Rather than being hobbled by our past racism, what if we owned it and used our shared history to stand in places of empathy? I think we have a lot to offer the world, and I feel like we're hobbled because of our racial past. Let's own up to it and stand in places of empathy. What if we were willing to speak up and stand up against systemic racism because we engaged in it ourselves and we have come to understand its consequences? What if we were willing, like Jesus, to claim all flesh as our own? It's my faith that Jesus Christ is no respecter of persons, and that we are all brothers and sisters in God's human family. And I leave that faith and testimony with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Professor Reeve, for that excellent presentation and for aiding our understanding as to how both the temple and the priesthood racial restrictions came about and what we can do today. I think it's much more complex than some may have previously thought. And ultimately, we often forget that these restrictions affected women and children, as well as Black men. We'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Lola and I would like to ask you a couple of questions. Lola, can I hand over to you for the first one?
Yeah, of course. Hi, Professor Reeve. Thank you so much for joining us. I think what you've shared with us will have some people really thinking about the way we teach history in our church. It may leave them with perhaps more questions than answers. But for me, I just admire the fact that you have dedicated so much time, effort, resource into unearthing Black history and bringing that to light. And I guess one of the more obvious questions, the question that I kind of wanted to ask very early on was something that I wanted to kind of ask: what has motivated you as a white person, as a white member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Charlotte and I wondered what has motivated you to dedicate so much time, resource, and effort into unearthing this type of history. I think we're having some.
Yeah.
There we go. Sorry, I inadvertently muted myself. Yeah, thank you for that question. In my estimation, the body of Christ isn't complete until all of its members are represented. And that moment in 1908, it feels like we collectively erased from Latter-day Saint memory our Black Latter-day Saint pioneers. And I'm at heart a social historian, meaning history from the bottom up instead of history from the top down. Without our Black Latter-day Saint pioneers being represented, and that includes Jane Hunter in 1853 in London, England, as a Black Latter-day Saint. Without those members represented, the body of Christ isn't whole. And how can we heal from racism if we don't understand its lessons from the past? In my estimation, as a historian, history is a part of the answer. And so it's out of a desire for us to claim our rightful place as sons and daughters of God and God's broader family. I believe we have a lot to offer the world, and we can stand in against racism if we're willing to understand the complexity of our own history and own it, and be willing to stand in places of empathy because of what we've learned. So it's, I'm an idealist at heart. I'm a realist in terms of, the nature of our past, but we can learn. Our history doesn't always affirm us, and that's okay. We can learn from the mistakes as well as the wisdom, and it's a desire for us to be better people, to claim the Zion vision that I think this gospel represents.
I mean, I honestly, I couldn't agree more. And I think as members of the church, we're kind of taught that we can learn from our past, we can change, we can improve. We're a people that believe in kind of progression. And I guess with that kind of backdrop, I wonder what kind of reception you have received from members of the church, both Black and white, in your unearthing and your discovery and your history with the work that you're doing.
I would say overwhelmingly positive feedback. I've had members of my own congregation who have one Latter-day Saint who came up to me after reading the book and tears in her eyes and said, "Thank you for providing an explanation. I didn't want to believe in a racist God. I now have answers." I've had those kind of experiences. There's certainly been some pushback. If you engage in a public way like this, I think you have to be prepared for that. And I am, but I think the overwhelming experience has been positive. The Kennedy Center for International Studies at BYU selected my book as a book of the semester, invited me down to BYU, my alma mater, to give a talk. It was a true honor for the scholarship to be embraced that way. And I think, in the classrooms, to have it be taught and to have an influence on the way that we understand our past. The church history department invited me down to present to them the Public Affairs Department of the church invited me to present. I think there is a desire to learn from the past and to shape a better future as a result. And so I won't say that there haven't been some negatives, because there certainly have. I gave a fireside in Seattle. I had a white Latter-day Saint stick around and insist that I would be held accountable before Brigham Young one day. Upset at sort of the history that I had laid out. But that's been rare. And I think people are, I think, looking for answers, and the experience has been quite positive.
It's good to hear. It's good to hear. I think, Charlotte, you have a final question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about Orson Pratt, Paul, because having read the book myself, and if anybody wants to see what the cover, I've got it here. It looks like this. The Orson Pratt, you mentioned in your presentation, speaks up and effectively against slavery. I think some of the quotes here that I've noted are, Pratt argued that God alone dictated and administered divine curses, and that they were particular to a time and place and did not automatically touch all future generations. He said specifically, shall we take then the innocent African that has committed no sin and damn him to slavery and bondage without receiving any authority from heaven to do so? And in relation to slavery, he said apparently it was enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. So Orson spoke up, as I understand, in the legislature. Can you tell us a little bit more about Orson and the role that he played? And can you, do you have any lessons that we can draw from Orson Pratt's actions for ourselves today?
Yeah, you know, it's really quite remarkable because we have evidence that he's also advocating for Black male voting rights in 1852 in Utah Territory. You know, this is a couple of decades ahead of even the rest of the U.S. You know, slavery is still legal in the American South at this moment, and knowing that he's advocating for Black male voting rights helps us to understand some of the horrible things that Brigham Young says in response. Brigham Young, you know, will say, well, Black people can't rule over me in this church, meaning they won't have the priesthood, and they can't rule over me in this territory, meaning they won't have the vote. And Brigham Young articulates that on the morning of the 5th of February, 1852. And so in terms of your question of being willing to stand up, we don't have an indication that Orson Pratt was allowed to respond that day, but he, in a speech, but he does respond with his vote, because the legislative minutes tell us that he votes against 2 municipal bills, just rubber stamp bills that would have normally just passed with no objection. And the legislative minutes tell us that he votes no because they didn't allow Black men to vote in those 2 municipal bills. And I think it's, once again, his willingness to stand up, to be able to stand, willingness to even stand alone. And as Latter-day Saints were taught, you know, stand by your convictions. And it seems that Orson Pratt is a man of conviction at this moment, who is willing to speak up and stand up against inequality, to speak in favor of equality for his fellow Black Latter-day Saints or Black people in the territory, regardless if they were Latter-day Saints, advocating for Black male voting rights. So for me, it's really quite remarkable and a fantastic example of a willingness to stand alone against the crowd, stand by his moral convictions, and speak forcefully for equality. A great example, I think, for all of us, where we might find ourselves in positions where we might have to stand alone if we are willing to engage in matters of racial equality in the 21st century.
Excellent, thank you so much. I know, and I'm sure there are going to be many questions for you, Paul, and we will endeavour to answer those, or Paul will endeavour to answer those. He will be here at the end of the session. So as I've said earlier, please do put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will try to get to those, because I can almost feel people behind the screen asking those questions, shouting them at the screen. So please do pop them into that Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. I just want to again thank you, Paul, for that excellent and wide-ranging presentation in such a short period of time on our history in this area, and just for sharing with us your insights from your research and scholarship, which is unparalleled. I think your desire to amplify the voices of those Black members who've gone before and who remain with us today is ennobling and humbling to me. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. It's really been an honor.
Now I'm just going to move into the Q&A because I know that there have been many questions. I'm just going to select a few, try to get through as many of those few as we can. I have, is the recording available? There should be a recording available, and just watch out in your ward WhatsApps and other communication channels for when that will be available and where you can access it. The answer is most likely yes. Paul, will your slides be made available?
Happy to share my slides, sure.
The answer there is yes. Paul, we have another question. Did Brigham Young not have different views on Black people? Apparently saying that people could be killed if they intermarried, i.e. Black with white. That's a tough question, but we'd like to put that one to you.
Yes, it is a tough question. So remember the minutes, those 13 surviving lines of that 3rd of December, 1847 meeting. Brigham Young speaks out stridently against race mixing. And then he returns to it in 1863 in a sermon that's also published in the Journal of Discourses. And he will say that penalty for race mixing is death on the spot. It's an extreme position, even in 19th century America. There's no evidence that it was ever there was ever any follow through, but it's an example of his bombastic style that just sometimes represents Brigham Young. And almost every state in the nation has laws against Black-white race mixing. Some states against white Native American race mixing, and some against white Asian race mixing. So there's that bigger historical context within which Brigham Young has emerged, but nonetheless, his speaking against it is extreme. And yet he does, at least twice in the historical record, advocate capital punishment as a penalty.
Wow. Thank you for answering that. That's a tricky one. And akin to that, in some respects, is this question: why would divine intervention not step in to stop this restriction? If this was not God's will, why did it happen for so long? What's your view on that? Obviously, you can't speak for the church. What's your view on that?
Yeah, obviously, I'm only speaking from how I understand the historical record. What I see taking place is this growing in precedent over time, each succeeding generation unwilling to violate the precedent of the previous generation. And then especially when Joseph F. Smith falsely suggests it began with Joseph Smith himself. There's a long tradition of honoring the founder of the faith. And when that becomes the memory for the 20th century, it becomes entrenched and the leadership believes it. It's not until the 1970s that you have historians who start to go back and look at the record and say, there's no evidence, in fact, that it begins with Joseph Smith. And that helps begin the unraveling. It's the way that it accumulates this precedent over time, and they start tracing it back to the beginnings with God. It's always been in place, becomes the narrative in the 20th century. And then the other part of my answer is just that God allows us agency. It's a fundamental part of the plan, and that includes allowing prophets agency. Agency to make mistakes, agency in Brigham Young's case to say racist things. His 5th of February speech is drenched in racism. I know I'm talking, this is hard history, but nonetheless, when God makes a prophet, he doesn't revoke his agency. I think we need to allow our leaders to be human, but also one thing that I see taking place sometimes is just people circling the wagons to defend Brigham Young rather than simply acknowledging that he got this wrong. But also remember a fundamental Latter-day Saint tenet: we believe in eternal progression. Do we really think Brigham Young is somewhere in the eternities stuck on his position from 1852? I'm firmly convinced that Brigham Young has repented, and he wants us to also repent. We believe in eternal progression. Let Brigham Young progress and let us progress. And a part of the progression is acknowledging our own racism and being willing to repent and move forward. Uh, so I know it's difficult history. I know it lasted for a long time. The way that I see the sources, it just becomes entrenched, and it's really President Kimball, as early as 1963, as an apostle, he is on record as referring to it as a possible error, someone who's willing to rethink, common understanding of the time. And I think he takes that attitude with him into his presidency and is willing to investigate and finds there isn't evidence to substantiate. It begins with Joseph Smith.
Thank you for that considered response. And a similar question, and I think a lot of individuals have asked this, is presidents of the church have taught that God will never allow the president to lead the Latter-day Saints astray, and God will remove any man who stands at the head of the church who intends to mislead its members, which makes me wonder how so many presidents of the church were able to continue in the injustice of restricting Black members from the priesthood and temple blessings for so many years. I'm aware God isn't to blame for the mistakes of men, but as these were presidents of the church who were leading the church, it just makes it a bit difficult to understand. Could you share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, the racial question raises the question of prophetic fallibility, and I wish we did a better job once again of talking about this as Latter-day Saints and allowing our leaders to be human. Joseph Smith calls himself a rough stone rolling, the process of life rubs off some of those rough edges. Joseph Smith, I see on race moving towards a completely open racial vision by the end of his life, and Brigham Young moving, unfortunately, in the other direction. I think it's important to anchor that notion, God will not allow the prophets to lead the church astray, within its historical context. I'm a historian. I always have to talk about context. Remember, Wilford Woodruff is the one that says that in 1890. What's the context? The context is he is claiming a revelation to end polygamy. He's going about Utah Territory, and Latter-day Saints are saying to him, you are a fallen prophet. You bowed to political pressure. His response is, I actually got a revelation. God showed me the federal government would start confiscating our temples unless we abandon polygamy. The trade-off is polygamy for temples. And he's saying, God will not give me a revelation to lead the church astray. That's the proper context for that statement. We then rip it out of its context and act as if it's a surefire guarantee for everything the prophet says over the dinner table to his family, for heaven's sake. That's not at all the context for that statement. Wilford Woodruff is saying, God will not give me a revelation that's going to lead us astray in the face of Latter-day Saints who have sacrificed so much to defend their plural families, saying it's time to abandon polygamy. And they're saying, you're a fallen prophet. He's saying, God won't give me a revelation. And within that context, that's a defensible statement. Stripped out of that context, we act as if anything the prophet says somehow is, scriptural canon. And it's not, in fact, what Wilford Woodruff intended when he was saying it to the saints to defend the manifesto as a revelation.
Very interesting. Again, probably something we'll discuss further, and I'm sure in the Relief Society lessons further down the line. Paul, another question for you is, how much help did you receive from the church archives?
Absolute 100% help, given open access, fundamental relationship with the church history department. I still maintain a positive relationship, and I'll say our two church historians at the time, Elder Marlon Jensen and Elder Stephen Snow, said to me personally, if you're ever told no, no doesn't always mean no, please come to us. I never really had to use that, but I'm only saying that to you to indicate that I was given access to the sources to allow me to do my research.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. Also, another question, Paul, again for you, um, is somebody asks to continue. What bothers me is that the Book of Mormon not just once but repeatedly asserts that blackness is a consequence of unrighteousness and that the gospel will only be taught to the Lamanites after the Gentiles. I would love to have this question addressed. I think this makes it difficult to assert that Brigham Young was the source of these doctrines. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let me clarify. Brigham Young only gives one reason and one reason alone for the racial restriction. It's the curse of Cain and Cain killing his brother Abel. And he only resorts to the book of Genesis. So he never draws upon the Book of Mormon, in other words. Now, I'm not denying that then we have racial verses in the Book of Mormon that we should grapple with. But I am trying to differentiate the only reason he gives for the restriction, the only source that he will draw upon is the book of Genesis in the Bible, never the Book of Mormon, never the Book of Abraham, never the Book of Moses. So it's important to keep that in mind. So then you turn to the racial verses in the Book of Mormon. 19th century Latter-day Saints understood them to apply to Native Americans, not to African Americans. And I think we need to do a better job of teaching race when we talk about scriptures, so that we can come to an understanding of what's taking place in the Book of Mormon. Racism is a sin, even when, and especially when, a prophet engages in it. So can we understand what Nephi is doing? His brothers have now separated. He tells us right before those racial verses where he introduces what he talks about as this racial curse, that they're making preparations and building defensive weapons to maybe have to go to war against them. I read that as a historian, anytime any nation goes to war, you dehumanize your enemies. And I see Nephi dehumanizing his brothers with the potential of having to maybe go to war and kill them. So he's talking about them in racialized terms and attributing to God, a skin and blackness. We know God doesn't zap us if we sin with dark skin, for heaven's sake. So there's the potential that they have intermarried with other peoples. By this point, the Lamanites have intermarried with other peoples by this point. If you want to read those verses literally, there's a great way to read them metaphorically, and I will refer you to Marvin Perkins and Darius Gray's Blacks in the Scriptures, because it will walk you through the process of reading those metaphorically. If you want to read them literally, then you have to understand that what's going on there is cultural, not racial. There are moments in the Book of Mormon where Lamanites are more righteous than the Nephites. And the overarching message of the Book of Mormon is a rejection of white supremacy. Because if you want to read it literally, then it's the dark-skinned people who win the Book of Mormon. They wipe out the people who think they are superior because of their white skin. And look at Jacob's temple sermon in 3 Jacob 3, where he gives an anti-racism sermon. So once again, if you want to read all of that literally, understand the overarching message of the Book of Mormon is a profound rejection of white supremacy and white nationalism.
Thank you, Paul. I know we have so many other questions. I think there were 74 that were put into the Q&A, and we've gone way over time, so I won't be able to ask any more at this point. But I think the final question we would like to ask you, Paul, specifically is who has been your favorite Black person from your research for Century of Black Mormons, and why?
Oh, man. I just got emotional because I thought about Frida Lucretia McGee Ballou. She is baptized in a creek outside of Tylertown, Mississippi in 1909. Her entire family converts. Her youngest brother, I found the family after I found their baptismal record. I found the family in the 1910 US Census with the youngest child who had been born during the family's conversion, the youngest child named Moroni. I knew I had the right family when I saw that census record. Baptized in a creek in 1909, 1 month after the June 1978 revelation, she's traveled 1,000 miles to be in the Washington, D.C. temple. It's over 69 years later. She waited 69 years to be allowed into a Latter-day Saint temple. And she calls it the happiest day of her life. She is sealed by proxy to her husband that predeceased her, the love of her life. And for her, she lives into her 90s. And for her, she calls it the happiest day of her life. I am just in awe that Frida stuck it out for over 69 years before she was allowed into a temple. And it highlights once again that it wasn't merely a priesthood restriction, it was a priesthood and temple restriction. And she is an example of faith and endurance and a love of her Savior, despite the racial restrictions that prevented her from receiving all of the blessings that were available to other Latter-day Saints. I think of her every time I go to the temple and hold her memory with me because of the lessons that she continues to teach.
Wow, thank you. 69 years. Wow, that's some faith. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for addressing the questions that we did have. I know we had many, many more, and I'm sure that this conversation will continue across our stake and across other stakes as well, moving forward. We can better see our Black brothers and sisters and better help them to feel as a part of our congregations. Thank you again for joining us for this special session.